Okay, so I'm at RSPB Oosfen. I'm with Richard Taylor and Ian Weller from RSPB. Hi there.
Hi there.
And you've taken me on a walk across the site to, where exactly are we?
We're at the northern or the Erith end of the site, which we opened to the public in 2021, if I remember correct. So what we've been looking at here is 3 areas of reed bed that are sort of relatively early on in the sort of vegetation succession. So, the reed cover here is not a sort of 100%, and the water isn't particularly deep yet.
Ah, right. So the history of this site, am I right in saying that this was a quarry, or this, and next door, Fen Drayton, they were quarries, is that correct?
That is correct, although here at Oosfen it is still a working quarry.
Right.
So something like, correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, but I think about half of the area that was in the planning application, the original application, has now been quarried. That is now managed by the RSPB, but there's still a fair bit of quarrying to go.
Yeah, we've turned about 180 hectares into wetland habitat, but there is probably still another 200 to go. So as a quarry, we design an area to create as a wetland habitat. They then create that habitat and then they hand it over to the RSPB to manage. And they can then continue quarrying on a new area. And so it progresses in the stage. So we get these individual cells at different times. And that's why we have this succession of developed vegetation succession across the reserve.
So this all started, if we went back to Fen Drayton, am I right in saying something like 1980s, something like that it started?
So Fen Drayton Lakes was a quarry in 1980s, probably on to the 1990s before they finished. Back then, conservation wasn't really as thought of, or the design of the habitat wasn't as created. So they're much more large lakes with a couple that were designed for wildlife and turned to nature reserves. And we're always trying to look for how we can improve them, and we're constantly tweaking them. But the main difference between Oosfen and Fen Drayton Lakes is that time scale. Fen Drayton Lakes, it's very it's much further along in the succession period, where here, as Richard said, we're only 2021, so it's very early stages of development of a reed bed.
So what sort of birds do we get? Well, it's early October. What could we expect to see here now?
We saw some bearded tits earlier on. We saw some marsh harriers flying over. Chetty's warblers are here, reed buntings, things like that. The peak times of year is sort of our spring, sort of early summer, when we have a lot of various species of birds that fly in from Africa and make this site their home for breeding. And then also in the winter time, we sort of have wildfowl that come in and use flooded areas and things like that.
Right, so some birds come here to breed, others breed elsewhere, and then they overwinter here.
That's correct, yes.
Some birds are species are sort of resident all year round. So, I mean, we do have bittern here at the moment, but you're probably not going to see them. And if you want to maximise your chance of seeing a bittern, spring, early summer is the best time, because the males will be displaying vocally, booming. Yeah. And they're quite easy to hear when they do that. And the females, once they've got extra mouths for feed, will be making additional feeding flights back and forth. And that's going to be your best time of year to pick something up. I will say sort of September time, back end of summer, you're in with quite a good chance of seeing bearded tits, because at this time of year, they tend to aggregate into larger groups and they make a lot of noise. And I know certainly 2 mornings ago, there were multiple groups of sort of 10 plus flying around this end of the site, making a lot of noise.
Yeah. Yes, I didn't see it. I heard them first, and then we saw them.
Exactly. Yeah. If you can get your ear in for the sound they make, which is a really quite distinctive ping sort of noise, and then home in on that, particularly at this time of year, you've got a very good chance of seeing, several at once. But they're here throughout the year, and they can be a little bit quieter in the middle of the breeding season. They do still make that pinging noise, and if you keep your ears pinned back and home into where you hear that sound, you've got a very good chance of seeing them.
Now, just in terms of actively managing this landscape, we talked about this earlier, that it's not just a question of just let it grow wild. You have to do stuff.
Yeah, that's right. I suppose the big factors in terms of management are what you do with the water level, so how deeply you flood areas. And then there's a couple of things you need to consider when managing reed beds. I suppose the main thing is that left to their own devices, reed beds will naturally, over time, they will effectively dry out, and they will become drier and drier. And in many cases, wetland scrub will move in, and slowly but surely your reed bed will turn into wet woodland. Now, drier reed bed and wet woodland are valuable habitats in their own respect, and there are a number of species that do very well in those habitats. A lot of the reason that Ouse Fen is here now and that has been designed the way it has is to cater for reed bed specialists that really need earlier successional stages before the trees move in.
Yes.
This came about because, in the late last century, we became very much aware that bittern numbers in the UK had absolutely crashed through the floor. And after research, it was concluded that the reason was because the areas of large wet reed bed that we did have in this country, for example, the Suffolk coast and places like that, they were just getting old and they were drying out, and hence the focus on wet reed bed here.
So the way I had it explained to me at Paxton Pits was, if we just leave things alone, don't touch them, given the size of England, if we just focus on England, it's to support a rich diversity, biodiversity. We actually do need to do active management. Leaving it on its own, it will become much more monocultural.
Absolutely. There just isn't the room in the UK to allow natural processes to do their thing. Thinking particularly about river valleys and places where, river channels would shift over time. And it's really very difficult to do that given, the pressure on land use that there is. And because of that, conservationists and land managers really do need to step in and manage stuff actively to make sure that we have the variety of habitats, because left to their own devices, as we've said, you end up with wet woodland.
Now, we've been walking along the Great Ouse, and I'm interested in what interaction there is with this, because I think there's something different between Fen Drayton and Ouse Fen in the way you interact with the river.
Yes, that's right. At this stage, the reed bed part of our reserve does not interact with the river at all. In the near future, though, we will be abstracting from the river, so we will be getting river water into the site, and that will be providing our water. Having said that, just the other side of the river, it's also a part of Ouse Fen, which is not reed bed, it's sort of wet grazing area called Bury Fen. That floods every year, every winter, regular as clockwork, and that is, we sort of manage that in winter deliberately like that for the benefit of wintering wildfowl and stuff like that.
So Bury Fen, actually, that's also where skating used to take place.
Yes, yeah. I don't think it's happened there for probably 15 or more years. But yes, certainly. That was back in the day, that was a regular winter pastime for people around here.
And again, thinking about times of flooding, that's what we would expect in this environment. Fen Drayton, that's a place that would flood, that would take on floodwater from the river.
So yes, Fen Drayton Lakes is actually classified as a reservoir. So yeah, when river floods, it takes on a body of water, and then that gradually over the spring seeps back into the river as the river lowers. We have noticed over the last sort of 5 so years that we are getting deeper floods. Yeah, water pressure, runoff and everything else. The rivers are getting fuller, and it's causing us to have deeper and longer periods of flood throughout the winter months.
So I think, again, we're talking about another site, a completely different site, but the Ouse Washes, which is something when we get to Erith, we'd be walking past. All of that area between there and Denver, that's meant to flood in winter, but there have been some concerns that floods in the summer as well, which is breeding season.
That's correct. There has been sort of set aside land sort of to the left and the right of the Ouse Washes main stretch to compensate. So there's always those areas of land for breeding waders and particularly to nest in. Yeah, it's a real struggle for us to sort of plan anything when we don't know when you're going to flood and you don't know for how long. And also, like you say, you prepare for the summer and then, your summer can sort of be wiped out, especially down on the washes. So I think they've been enjoying this year that they've actually been able to do some active management throughout the summer, unlike last year.
Okay, so we're on the other side of the river. Oh, to explain, the Ouse Valley Way is on the other side of the river. It is possible to get to it and visit this while walking along the Ouse Valley Way.
There's a place which you will see on your map marked as Browns Hill Staunch, which is sort of in between Erith and Holywell, and there's a footpath bridge across there, so if you want to jump across to the opposite side of the riverbank, you do have an option there as well.
You've already mentioned some of the birds we can see, but what tips have you got to help us really get our eye in, and what prep can we do?
I'd say if you can get hold of a pair of binoculars, it really pays to have them with you. I mean, for the entirety of the walk, if you don't mind carrying them, I think it's a good idea, but particularly particularly if you come here, I'd say do if you can, bring a pair along with you.
And in order to identify birds by sound and by sight.
Can I plug Merlin as an app? It is a wonderful app that's very easy to download and use on your phone. And one feature of that app that particularly stands out is that you can listen in to the sounds in the environment around you, and it will give you a fairly accurate identification of what the birds are that you are hearing. And as that bird makes the sound, the species will sort of flash to say that it's hearing what it thinks is that particular species. And once you start getting your ear in, and I would advocate people using this all year round in their gardens and everything. Once you start getting your ear in, and then following the sound and seeing the bird and tying this all together in your brain, you will find that really rather quickly you'd be surprised how quickly your bird ID skills really pick up.
And then learning more about the behaviour. Where do you learn about that?
Well, if you're lucky enough to have the luxury of time to stand around looking at birds, then nothing beats doing your own observations, especially throughout the year, and seeing how, behaviour can change, interactions between members of the same species. So you might, for example, very early spring, you will see display flights of marsh harriers around here. That's something definitely worth coming to see, because that can really be quite spectacular. And then maybe with the same species later on in the summer, you'll see sort of food deliveries coming in to the nest, or food passes, mid-air food passes between the parents. And then once you get into the depths of winter, you'll see really quite large aggregations of this bird, maybe 30 or 40 of them all coming down in the middle of winter to roost in the same area.
Yeah.
So, putting in the time pays off. But I understand that not everybody has the luxury of, hours and hours and hours to spend on this sort of thing. So read around. If it interests you, just soak that stuff up from, whatever source you can, as long as it's reputable, of course.
Maybe start with the RSPB website.
Absolutely, yes. The RSPB website would be a wonderful place to start. But, other sources are available.
This is a large site that we can walk around. What do you think about the difference between walking around and just staying still?
I would advocate an even mix of both, because you very often need to stay still for a while in order for things to show up or return from where they may initially have been startled from. But at the same time, it's also good to move from site to site. So I would say move from spot to spot, spend some time, settle down in each spot, and let things let's see if things develop, and move cautiously as well. And always look ahead of you as you move.
Other birders seem to be... Well, I think we're birders now. Now we're standing here. I'm officially a birder as well, am I?
You are.
Great. And so another birder came up to me and just told me what he'd seen this morning. So he'd been out early. He'd gone and worked out what was here. And then he was quite keen to talk to me about that. So it's a good idea to talk to other people as well.
Absolutely, because many people are very keen to share their knowledge and their expertise and their excitement that they may have seen on that day in particular.
Fantastic. So we just come up onto a little hill, and there's a beautiful white bird. Well, that's how I'd describe it. What actually is it?
That is a great white egret. Believe it or not, if this was 10 years ago, we'd all be very excited, me and Richard would be, because they would have been very rare. But nowadays, they're becoming more and more common. Same along with the cattle egret and the little egret, that also you will find at both reserves.
Yeah. So something of a success story?
It is. It's just their range is just moving more northwards. So there's a lot of species. We had some glossy ibises come in, caused a bit of a stir on the reserve. There is just this move through Europe coming up. So that's what's quite exciting about the future of the reserve. We're looking at other species now that we probably wouldn't have even comprehended back in sort of 2005 when this project was first getting started. And we're starting to tweak our management to sort of try and attract these birds and create habitats that they would breed in. The main focus was often very much for the bitterns, because the bitterns were in mass decline, but their population is starting to do really well. And we will continue to manage for the bittern, but we are looking at other species, along with like cranes and things like that have started to become a bit more familiar in this along the Ouse Valley Way.
So to what extent do you learn from others and other sites, and what things do you have to learn for yourself here?
We're constantly trying to learn. Yeah, I mean, it's one of our enjoyments is trying to tweak the reserve as much as possible. So yeah, we go to other reserves, see what they've been up to. Throughout the RSPB, we have dynamic wetland train. Just hit scans, find out, see what other reserves are doing, what's worked, what hasn't worked. Because that's sometimes important as well. Is what hasn't worked. So we don't repeat. But the difference is every site's different.
Oh, what's this? I don't think I'd make a very good sports commentator. 2 birds flew over. What are they?
Yeah, well, they've disappeared now. I'd say reed buntings.
Reed buntings. Okay.
And they're here all year round, keeping various predatory birds well fed.
So we're standing on, well, I'm going to call it a hill. I mean, it's a raised promontory, and so this is a good location to come and make observations. But a couple of times a year, you do something different. You allow people to go in. Have you got some sort of canoeing thing going on?
Over at Fendrayton Lakes, we hold 2 days of the year where we do a canoe safari. And that's taking people out onto one of our lakes, and we just take people for a gentle meander around, and while paddling through, you get a very different perspective of a reedbed. You're right submersed in it. The bird, quiet, so we don't disturb the birds too much, and so often we can see various things. And yeah, it's become quite a successful thing. We've done it for 2 years now, and I'm sure we'll be doing it next year. We do it in September because obviously we don't want to disturb birds in the breeding season, and it starts getting a little bit cold and unpredictable weather later on in the year. So we stick to September because still birds can be nesting all the way into August. So we try and leave the birds to themselves as much as possible.
So here comes the egret again. It's just come round for another swoop. So that makes sense. You were saying before, just stay still and then a bird will come back to you.
Absolutely, yes. And they are actually breeding now quite close by on the ooze washes. And we do find that birds are using the reedbed quite frequently, particularly in dry years when food's harder to get elsewhere. If we have an area where we've kept the water level a little bit lower and there's sort of splashy lagoon areas that aren't too deep, they're very happy to get stuck in and find food in them.
Yeah. But as you say, that comes down to active management, thinking about creating different environments.
Absolutely. I mean, what would be sort of a bitten's optimum water level is going to be too deep to be absolutely perfect for something like a great egret. Having said that, they will both get by in suboptimal conditions, but you try and do your best for your target species where you can.
So we're now sitting in a little dip in front of a lake. It's rather nice here. There are coots on the river, on the lake. So we've been talking about birds up to now, but obviously birds need to eat.
Absolutely, yes, they do. And a big component of the diet of many of the species we have here, perhaps unsurprisingly, is fish. And now fish are wonderful and beautiful in their own right. But yes, as we are managing for species of bird, we're quite keen to establish a regionally appropriate, in terms of species, and diverse and self-sustaining fish population in the various different areas of the reserve, which you might be forgiven thinking would sort of sort itself out over time, and it perhaps would over the time span of decades, but we've found we've had to be a bit more interventionist, and we have had to introduce fish to various parts of the reserve and to sort of undertake an ongoing monitoring programme just to see how those fish are doing.
Well, how are they doing?
It depends. So if you go to the oldest part of the site, which is the south end of the site, the over end, that very first part of reedbed was actually uniquely filled up from the IDB, the Internal Drainage Board drain, and that filled up with fish of its own accord. We had pike, perch, roach and tench in there, and they just got there of their own accord. And there was a question as to whether following that fish would just spread through the site with time. It did happen, but it happened fantastically slowly. And furthermore, rudd, which is a species that we find locally, just didn't seem to move in. So we actually introduced rudd and these other species to more distant parts of the reedbed that just didn't seem to be getting anything on their own apart from the ever-present pike and stickleback, which seem to move into puddles after they've been wet for about 2 weeks.
Yeah. So is any of that down to their food source?
Or do we probably not. I would say, in the absence of fish, the water bodies on the reserve are absolutely packed with aquatic invertebrates.
Right.
So for fish, which are really all species, even the sort of carnivorous species like pike, very early on in their life, they're going to eat aquatic invertebrates. We've got those in spades. There was a bit of a question as to whether we needed the water weeds, the sort of pond weeds, and that to sort of grow up to create a more sort of complex sort of structure to the habitat underwater. But no, we just think it's, I don't know what you'd like to call it, but sort of laziness and a reluctance to move on the part of the fishes. What we don't have here, which you will have in natural sort of river systems, is great big floods which sort of force fish to move around here. We do move water around the site, but it's not passing through control structures at the sort of speed that I think is really going to wash large quantities of fish into new areas. Consequently, we have brought them in, and when we find time, we like to collect some of our own fish, tench in particular, they're very expensive to buy, and move them from parts in the reserve where they're established into parts where they're not established.
Are you saying move them from parts where they're happy to parts where they may not be happy?
They'd be perfectly happy, but they just don't. Particularly when you have water bodies like ours that aren't just big featureless lakes. They're quite complex. You can even find that if you pop fish into one sort of corner of a complex water body with lots of channels, and you come back a couple of years later and survey for them, you will often find that they haven't spread out at all. They've just sort of stayed in the same area. So yeah, it does pay to be active and to help things along. And the idea is you only have to do this once. And once they're there, they are there. Although it is worth mentioning, I wouldn't advocate rushing fish into all areas all at once, because if you do have areas like at the Erith end of the site currently, where we've introduced no fish at all, it means you are going to have arguably a sort of more interesting assemblage or biomass of underwater insects, because there's not going to be loads of hungry fish mouths gobbling them up all year round.
So we've just heard something, don't think we picked it up on the recording. What was that?
That was a Chetty's warbler. We have rather a lot of them, I have to say, all year round. They're quite interesting amongst the smaller birds in that they sort of get into the swing of their sort of singing, I suppose you could call it a song, their sort of territorial sound display as we move into winter. And with many species, you won't start hearing it until the breeding season really gets into full swing.
Right, so I think that almost half answers the question of why birds sing. So territory and mating.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, songs or sort of display calls, birds are just sort of advertising their presence, which will either be in order to dissuade other members of their own species from moving into their territory, or advertising the fact that this is their territory, it's rather nice, would you like to come along and consider mating with me?
Yeah. Is this the men or the ladies as well?
It is overwhelmingly with the species we have here. Yeah, it's going to be the males. Yeah.
Perhaps you should call them crooners.
Yeah. I think that's fair. I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
So even if we didn't come to Ouse Fen, if you just carried on the Ouse Valley Way on the other side of the river, there are some birds you still might hear from here. Is that right?
Absolutely, particularly in spring when the male bitterns are advertising themselves with that really distinct booming call. It doesn't really sound like any other bird. That's a very low frequency noise that travels vast distances for a good reason. And you will, provided the wind is either blowing in the right direction or not blowing at all, you will easily hear that from some distance away, surrounding villages, certainly from the riverbank.
Because just realised that sitting here, there is a problem with coming visiting here. You might just want to stay and not actually carry on walking the Ouse Valley Way.
That's very kind of you to say so.
Yeah. And so opening times, when can we come here?
So the times do shift throughout the year, as the sort of daylight hours change. Your first resort should always be the Ouse Fen website, but in general terms it's kind of dawn till dusk.
Okay, well, maybe I need to get on my feet and move on. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.